Hey there guys, Spud here, as always, and today you might be looking at this video thinking, what in the heck is going on here? How did Spud get an A-18C Hornet to spawn on the deck of the Admiral Kuznetsov? Well guys, this is something that I've been wanting to do for years now, ever since the original release of the Super Carrier and updated Admiral Kuznetsov for DCS World. Thanks to some community collaboration, I finally figured out what Lua files actually need to be edited to allow the Hornet to spawn on the vaunted Admiral Kuznetsov. So you might be thinking, Spud, why in the heck do you even care? How can this possibly be grounded in reality? Well, it's actually closer to reality than you might think. Of course, the Admiral Kuznetsov is a STOBAR, or Short Takeoff Barrier Arrested Landing Aircraft Carrier, and it's kind of the quintessential kind of example for this type of aircraft carrier. What that means is that aircraft have to launch under their own power, usually with the help of a ski jump, like here on the Admiral Kuznetsov, and then can be arrested with arrestor gear using a tailhook. Now, the F-18 Hornet was kind of originally seen very early in its lifespan as being a really good candidate for a lot of nations' smaller aircraft carriers. This was back when the British still had a bunch of their aircraft carriers that had ski jumps. The Spanish looked at it, the Italians looked at it, of course, before they opted to go with the Harrier, because the F-18 is a true multi-role aircraft, as well as it has such fantastic low-speed, high-angle of attack performance. The F-18 Hornet was always looked at as potentially being a fantastic candidate of an aircraft to be fielded on smaller nations, smaller aircraft, and in particular, STOBAR type of aircraft. Of course, having arrestor gear on an aircraft carrier is more complexity, more cost, and potentially not as much added benefit as you would think for a particular nation's aircraft carrier, especially if they don't also have catapults installed. So that's why nations have tended to gravitate towards either being a short takeoff and vertical landing aircraft carrier only, or a CATOBAR, or catapult assisted and arrestor gear equipped aircraft carrier. So that's why smaller nations like the UK, Spain, Italy, and even Thailand went with the Harrier, as opposed to modifying or upgrading or fielding new aircraft carriers to throw the F-18 Hornet on. But it's a very niche, very interesting topic that you can kind of find some bits and pieces of information on out there about the very early life and what the manufacturer of the F-18 envisioned the aircraft was able to do for export sales. Very cool stuff. And of course, more recently, the Indian Navy was interested in procuring the F-18 for their own STOBAR aircraft carriers. The US Navy, along with Boeing, has conducted many tests both here at Potomac River in Maryland as well as overseas in India to demonstrate the F-18E and F, and of course the A-18G Growlers, capability of using a STOBAR type aircraft carrier, of which the Indian Navy is currently the owner of two of those aircraft carriers. Of course, one of them is a modified Kiev-class assault ship that was modified to have all of its, anti-ship missiles pulled off of it, and having a ramp installed on the bow. Whereas their other aircraft carrier is essentially a new build aircraft carrier that is heavily based on the Admiral Kuznetsov type of class. So it is more grounded in reality to have an F-18 on the deck of the Admiral Kuznetsov than you might imagine. So this is something that I've always wanted to do, and I'm really grateful to my community for helping me figure out exactly how to make this happen. Personally, I believe that this shouldn't break integrity check. I believe that this should be a capability that should be added into the base files of DCS without any modifications. But of course, that's up to Eagle Dynamics and what they think is best for their sim. So with that in mind, guys, let's hop into the cockpit. Let's do a demonstration of operating off of the Admiral Kuznetsov, give you guys some tips and tricks for using the F/A-18 in the STOBAR environment, and then we'll hop over to my desktop and we'll take a look at the LUA files and how you can edit those to make this possible on your own for yourself in single player, or maybe your squadron, because it could be a lot of fun in multiplayer to do this with a whole bunch of Hornet pilots. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. Okay guys, let's go ahead and hop right into the cold start procedure for our F/A-18C Hornet as we sit on the deck of a STOBAR aircraft carrier. So guys, I looked high and low to try and find a fictional Indian Air Force or Indian Navy paint scheme for my Hornet, kind of like a la the Indians MiG-29Ks that they currently field, but I absolutely struck out. So if anyone could point me to a skin like that down in the comments section below, please let me know, and I'd be happy to throw that on to the jet next time we play with the Admiral Kuznetsov and the F/A-18 Hornet. So right off the bat here, we want to close the canopy because we got ourselves a nice, early, beautiful, stormy morning here in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Syria. And we want to try to avoid getting more soaked than we already are. Already got some friends down here on the left-hand side, other F/A-18s acting as test vehicles for our carrier trials of operating the Hornet in the STOBAR environment. As a side note, I've always liked the superstructure of the Admiral Kuznetsov. It's so cluttered and ridiculous, like every other Soviet or Russian ship. It's pretty cool. So there's one major thing that we have to contend with while operating in the STOBAR environment as opposed to the CATOBAR environment with our F/A-18. And that is, we have a very hard weight limit that we have to abide by in our Hornet in order to successfully launch off the bow of the Kuznetsov. Now that hard weight limit is going to be about 40,500 pounds. Anywhere over that, it's not going to be a performance issue. The jet will get airborne. It's going to be a landing gear strength issue. The landing gear will collapse as you start to go up the ramp. So we have to be very, very careful of that. I also prefer to launch with half flaps from position 3 over here because it gives us a little bit more run-up time and get us up into the air to get the aircraft configured into a cruise kind of configuration as opposed to staying in the landing configuration for too long. However, if we want to launch from position 1 or 2 up here on the bow, you want to have full flaps, but you want to be very, very careful because once you get airborne, you can very easily overspeed those full flaps, and now you have broken flaps for the rest of your sortie, and that's also going to make it very, very difficult to bring the jet back on board. So with that in mind, guys, let's go ahead and pull up the rearm and refuel menu. We're of course going to turn on the battery here because the intercom to talk to the ground crew only works with the battery turned on in the F/A-18. Now, one thing that I like to do when operating in the STOBAR environment with the F/A-18C is I like to sacrifice fuel carriage capacity and bring the, kind of more stereotypical weapons load you would see on an F/A-18 in a modern combat environment. And then, of course, go find myself a tanker and top off my tanks that way. Now, the Hornet, unfortunately, does not allow us to load empty external fuel tanks along with all of the other first-party Eagle Dynamics developed modules, but we can have a little bit of a workaround that to actually allow us to bring weapons and less fuel and kind of get around that kind of unfortunate little bit of reality of the F/A-18. So I always like to spawn my F/A-18 with about 20% of internal fuel, and we're going to go ahead and leave that. And we'll add some AIM-9 X-rays to our wingtips here, which of course that's what the Indian Navy would be utilizing on their Super Hornets once they start operating them off of their STOBAR carriers. Of course, we can see Sidewinders add barely any weight whatsoever. We'll go ahead and put an AT-FLIR pod on our number 4 station. It's going to be on our left cheek. On number 6, we'll put an AIM-120 Charlie. Again, these additions to the aircraft really add almost no weight at all. Then we'll go ahead and throw some fuel tanks on here, so that way we can have fuel tanks that'll be empty once we take off. I'll show you that workaround in a bit. So that way we can top those tanks off and fly and complete our mission with a nice long range, as well as bring in nice weapons load to complete our assigned task. Station 2, let's go ahead and put kind of a stereotypical loadout. We'll go 2 GBU-12s, and why don't we go with 2 GBU-38s on the left-hand side. It's probably a really good like close air support loadout, something of that nature. And we can see that it's really the fuel tanks that add a ton of weight down here. You can see we're just below that 40,500 pound limit. Again, going over that 40,500 pound limit will damage your aircraft going off of the bow of the carrier here. So something to keep in mind and just be cognizant of. I have done a lot of testing and really narrowed it down to that 40,500 pound limit. So you guys want to pretty much stick to that unless you find something better works for you. So I'll hit OK.
Copy.
And the ground crew will do their thing. Of course, guys, it does not matter which coalition that you have the Kuznetsov and your Hornet on. It can be both on the blue or the red and even the neutral, and it all works just the same. So with that in mind, and the ground crew doing their thing, let's go ahead and start our cold start procedure. Batteries on, APU's going on. You can see the ground crew is adding our various weapons.
Rearming complete.
Beautiful. Got ourselves a nice green light down here on our APUs. Let's crank that right-hand engine, so that way we can get hydraulic pressure to our brakes and our parking brake specifically as quickly as possible, so that way we don't accidentally taxi ourselves off of the deck. Alright, we're starting to ramp up our RPM in our right-hand engine, bringing that throttle to the idle detent. So with that, as the engine's spooling up, let's go ahead and turn on some systems. Oxygen on, of course. Radar operate, IFA for our INS. Something that I have noticed, which is kind of interesting and kind of funny, is our INS in IFA position here on the Kuznetsov takes longer to align than it does on the supercarrier, and of course longer than it does on dry land. For whatever reason, I'm not quite sure what the issue is. However, on the Kuznetsov, you can in fact run a CV alignment if you so desire. Alright, we've got our number 2 engine running, so let's go ahead and run the number 2. Or the number 1, I should say, the left-hand engine. And we'll bring that number 1 engine throttle into the idle detent. We'll bring our position lights to the on position. We'll make sure that our lights are off for now, even though we are in a IFR to marginal IFR environment. We'll only make sure we get those on once we are ready to launch. Alright. So, as expected, Betty is very worried about our internal fuel carriage capacity. And you guys should be aware of the fact that the Hornet has a logic built into its systems. When the squat switches are enabled, it does not allow the external fuel tanks to feed into the internal fuel tanks. We can see here we've got 0 fuel in our forward fuselage tank. The wing tanks are low, as well as the aft fuselage tank is very, very low, of course. So we need to get this fuel into the internal tanks very, very quickly. So if we come to our throttle, just aft of our throttle, we have our fuel control panel where we can find our, of course, our probe for air-to-air refueling, as well as our fuel dump switch, which is also going to be very, very important when operating on the STOBAR carrier. However, a lot of folks who fly the Hornet neglect these 2 switches right here. These 2 switches control the logic for how the external fuel tanks feed into the internal fuel tanks. With the squat switches enabled, of course, by default in the normal position, those switches will prohibit those external fuel tanks from flowing into the internal fuel tanks. However, if we put the external tanks into the override position, the forward position, then the external tanks will start to flow and feed into the internal tanks even while on the ground or on an aircraft carrier. And we'll get that probe retracted. There we go. So that's something to be mindful of, and it can be a great way to get exactly how much fuel and exactly how much weight you need to take off in this kind of unconventional environment in the Hornet. Once the external tanks are totally drained, you can go back to the norm position or leave them in override. It really doesn't matter. Now you might be wondering, why would this be a logic that's built into the aircraft? Well, number one, the tanks have to be pressurized with bleed air from the engines in order to actually suck fuel out of the tanks and into the internal tanks. And this can cause leakage of fuel on the deck of an aircraft carrier or on an airfield, which can then, be a fire hazard or a danger to personnel on the ground, as well as, of course, the pilot sitting in the cockpit, as well as if that pressurization fails, then there could be an issue with somebody getting hurt by flying debris, things of that nature. So that's why typically you only want to pressurize those tanks to get fuel out of them once you're up in the air. So we can see here that our internal tanks are almost full. There we go. So we'll go ahead and bring these switches back to the norm position. Our GPS alignment is still running. And we'll kind of do a sweep around the cockpit and make sure that we've got everything here. Do our takeoff trim. That's all good to go. FCS. For our takeoff, we'll do a stab trim about 14. That seems to work pretty well. HUD repeater over here. Waypoint 1. ECM on. Hook bypass set to carrier. Landing taxi light is going to be off for now. Flaps to half because we're taking off from the number 3 position. Anti-skid, of course, is going to be off when we're here on the aircraft carrier. That's so that way we don't have the anti-skid kick on with this wet carrier deck, release brake pressure, and accidentally dump us over the side of the aircraft carrier. Definitely a no-no to have anti-skid turned on when we're on the deck of a carrier. We'll set our bingo to about 6,000. That'll warn us pretty early about our fuel usage, as well as that will come back to later on why I want to set that to 6,000 for our demonstration today. Alright, let's do just a last sweep around the cockpit here. Everything is looking pretty darn good. We'll get our IFF turned on. Data link for the ICLS doesn't really matter with this aircraft carrier, but out of habit, I'll just turn that on. Coming around here, we'll uncage our radar altimeter. We'll go ahead and arm our ejection seat just in case something bad were to happen on the carrier and we just want to get out of the jet as quickly as possible. Got our FLIR, got our everything else is turned on. Cool, everything is looking good to go. So with that, let's go ahead and start our taxi out to position 3. Of course, with anti-skid turned on, when you press your nose wheel steer switch to bring the nose wheel steering into high gain, that is going to remain on, which is helpful. We'll bring our parking brake off, and we'll tell our ground crew to remove our wheel chocks.
Copy. Wheel chocks are now removed.
All right. So today we're not going to be using our HMD at all, so we're just going to skip the HMD alignment procedure. For a lot of, training missions that don't involve using the HMD or ferry flights or flight testing environments, a lot of pilots will opt to pull the joint helmet mounted cueing system off of their helmet just to avoid that extra weight on the top of their head, which can definitely strain the neck, especially when pulling Gs. Of course, being on an aircraft carrier, we're going to take it nice and slow, nice and under controlled with our taxi. when utilizing the Admiral Kuznetsov with the Hornet in DCS World, the Hornet lacks the interface to use the holdback blocks as well as the jet blast deflectors. So that is going to be a problem if you are trying to go as realistic as possible, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you do get those blocks to come up as well as you have the JBDs come up, if you say tell the aircraft to spawn hot on the runway before your spawn starting position, those will be up and they will break your landing gear as you are trying to take off. Now, to simulate, as well as basically get the same functionality as those holdback blocks, what we'll do is we'll actually tell the ground crew to set our chocks again, and then we will, of course, run up our engines, do a quick flight control test, control wipe, run through our last-minute checklist, our before takeoff checklist, and we'll run up our engines, and the chocks will actually hold us back like the holdback blocks do for the Su-33 flanker. Now, of course, this is rather unrealistic, because if you were in a Hornet and you push the throttle all the way into burners, or really up all that much at all, your aircraft would probably hop the chocks and get on going. But for our interest in wanting to replicate and make the Hornet work on the Kuznetsov, it works just fine. I also kind of like the deck lighting of this aircraft carrier. It reminds me of the deck lighting that is on the Tarawa, which I always think is very cool and very interesting looking. So we're here in our position at number 3. We're going to bring our wings down, wait till they're locked. For the takeoff, I always like to have nose wheel steering turned on, because the ship is sailing into the wind at about 20 knots and we have about a 20 knot headwind. The wind is going to catch the left-hand side of our vertical stabs and pull the nose to the left. So we need to be able to correct for that very quickly before our rudders become aerodynamically effective, as well as we have the little jog to the right on the center line that guides us for our takeoff, and having the nose wheel steering turned on for that is very important. So if you're taking off in an airfield, I would recommend always turn that nose wheel steering off at 70 knots, but for here on a STOBAR aircraft carrier, make sure that you leave it on. Alright, little last minute checks around the cockpit, good to go there, good to go there. We'll turn on our lights. Now, landing light's going to stay off. Our hook bypass is set to carrier, anti-skid's off. Flap set to half, we got 3 green on the landing gear. Our bingo is set where we want it. We've got our navigation set. We've got all of our systems on. Our caution advisories panel is extinguished. We are ready to rock and roll. So we'll go ahead and have the ground crew set the chocks.
Chief, place the wheel chocks. Copy. Wheel chocks are now in place.
All right. So with that, we will go ahead and push the throttle up. We'll do a quick control wipe. Everything's looking good. Burners. Ground crew.
Chief, remove the wheel chocks.
And away we go.
Copy. Wheel chocks are now removed.
There we go. Going down the deck here and up into the air. Gears up. Flaps are up. Power's back to full mil. And we made it. Pretty cool, right? I think it's cool. And again, guys, not wholly ungrounded in reality. I mean, this could very well have happened for smaller European nations, as well as is potentially more likely to happen with Super Hornets for the Indian Navy. So it's absolutely pretty darn cool stuff, in my opinion. Alright, so because the Kuznetsov lacks, as well as I'm pretty sure also the Indian carriers still lack, a TACAN beacon, we'll set waypoint 0 with a carrier first spawned, and we'll set a course line from there because it hasn't changed its heading or bearing to 017 for our BRC. And of course, we'll also have to dump some weight in order to make our landing weight. So let's get rid of these GPU 12s and GPU 38s. So sorry for the taxpayers who paid for those, but we need to get rid of them right now. Let's pretend we're having some sort of emergency where we have to return to the ship. And they are gonzo. Back to safe. We'll turn these guys off. We'll select our fuel tanks just in case we need to dump those for any reason. And of course, normally, you know, if you're flying off of an aircraft carrier for the first time, definitely do it in VFR conditions. But I wanted to make this video look a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more interesting for you guys. And I absolutely love the rain effects while on an aircraft carrier in DCS. Next thing we'll do is let's go ahead and dump our fuel down to about 6,000 pounds of gas. So fuel dump is on. She's dumping. We've got our bingo set to 6,000 already, which we preset for the very reason that we want to get below our landing weight. And of course, our very smoky, conventionally powered Admiral Kuznetsov is very easy to see, even in IMC conditions. We're going to fly a Case 1 today, simply because we don't have a TACAN beacon, as well as that's just going to be the easiest for today's flight and demonstration. All right, let's check our checklist, see how heavy we are. The aircraft weight does not account for weight reduced via jettison, unfortunately, so we're just going to have to kind of hope that that is going to be under about 34,000 pounds when we get rid of our remaining gas we're trying to dump overboard. So land, hook, da-da-da-da-da, cool. Hook is good, anti-skid is off, flaps are going to be set in the brake, the wheels are going to be set in the brake, harness is locked, dispensers, we're going to make sure that those are off. And we are ready to go. So there's the ship. Now, one thing to also keep in mind, guys, is the Admiral Kuznetsov, as well as all other STOBAR carriers, if they were to be added to DCS, are a lot smaller than American aircraft carriers. As a result, you're probably going to have to modify the way you fly your pattern pretty heavily in order to account for that. You probably don't want to turn right at the round down, and you don't want to brake over the deck of the carrier. Otherwise, you'll just be scrunched into too small of a pattern, especially for DCS World flying. All right, so we had our fuel dump snap back via the spring loading. We'll extinguish master caution for bingo, and we'll bring our bingo down to, let's say, 35. Now, one of the major disadvantages of a STOBAR aircraft carrier is the fact that the aircraft required to be carried on it must have the performance abilities to actually get off of the deck. So that precludes aircraft like, say, an E-2 Hawkeye or any other larger cargo aircraft, things like that, to actually operate off of that carrier. So it limits things like having AWACS support, tanker support, things of that nature. But that also makes the Super Hornet a much better choice for the Indian Navy for their STOBAR carriers, because Hornets and Super Hornets have the innate ability to buddy refuel baked into them, where I don't think that the Rafale M, which is competing with the Super Hornet, has that ability, or at least not as of now. It probably would be rather trivial for Dassault to add that ability. But that also brings up the issue that the US Navy is facing now of buddy refueling does add those precious flight hours and airframe fatigue to those aircraft that you need to have available for combat operations or training operations for more tactical type of flying, rather than just flying circles in the sky, boring holes for air-to-air refueling purposes. So we're going to reduce the brightness of our HUD as much as possible here, so that way we can see the carrier very easily and not have to worry about like leaning out around the HUD in order to actually see what we're landing on. Now again, the LSO that we're used to for the AI Super Carrier, as well as the nice overlay for the meatball, is not going to occur here with the Admiral Kuznetsov, which is kind of unfortunate. Makes the landing a little more difficult, so I guess we'll see how my pass is going to be here. We're just going to go ahead and commence for our upwind and brake. Now my problem when I land on the carrier is I tend to have my downwind too close to the aircraft carrier, and then I tend to turn late. So let's see if I can correct that for today. And it looks like the ship is clear. We got a clear deck. Beautiful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and in the brake. So again, I'm going to try not to pull. Looks like we're out of the wearing squall, which is kind of nice. Not pull super hard. Flaps to full, gears coming down. I like to do that while I'm banked. That kind of helps preclude some of that ballooning effect that we see. A little bit of nose up trim in the turn. And we should be rather well situated on the downwind at this point. Let's check the carrier. Beautiful. We're at a little low on altitude, so let's go ahead and bring the throttle back up. Alright, last minute check. We've got our gear hook down, as symbolized by our solid donut rather than a flashing donut. And we'll make our turn. I want to try and maintain about 600 feet for our base to final turn. We'll see how that goes. A little fast, probably because I'm still a little heavy. Go ahead and cage the HUD so that way we can see our velocity vector and E-bracket. Probably turning a little tight at this point. Again, your pattern's going to be different from flying on the Super Carrier. But I do like the nice bright lights around the deck area, as well as it's got a nice dark black outline around it, which makes it very easy. Oh, I'm too low. Way too low. So if we start the approach too low, we're probably going to end too high, and if we start high, we're probably going to end too low. So let's see if we can correct here. Get that velocity vector right on the crook of the ship. Trying to maintain a little bit higher of an approach. I tend to get too close to the ramp of the Kuznetsov. Whoa boy, here we go. Yeah, I'm coming in too high, but I'm not going to try to lunge for the wires. And yep, so we came down too high of a vertical speed, and we skipped over the wires. Definitely stinks not having a meatball to guide you in. So another issue with the Admiral Kuznetsov, or Kuznetsov I should say, is that the jet, or the carrier from my knowledge, does not have a barrier to be erected should there be an issue with a aircraft or a pilot just having a horrible night in the barrel, and that's compounded by the fact that there is no way to have a large wing tanker or a buddy refueling capability that the Russians have organically with their Su-33s. So that's why when the Kuznetsov did do that deployment off the coast of Syria, they lost multiple aircraft due to pilot inexperience, which of course I'm showing that here, as well as mechanical failures, things of that nature. So let's see if we can do this again. We started low on that approach. On this one, we're starting high. Again, when you start low, you're going to finish high, and when you start high, you're going to finish low because of the corrections that we have to make. And that's true whether you're landing at an airfield in beautiful visual conditions, or you're shooting an approach for a carrier landing, or you are shooting an ILS approach through IMC. If you start high, you're going to finish low, and if you start low, you're going to finish high, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So let's see what we can do here. It's looking like a better approach. Speed is looking good. Our AOA is looking good. Got a little low there. A little power. Come on, Spud. You got it. You got it, Spud. There we go. All right. And you can see that angled deck is a beautiful thing. Flaps up. Wings coming up. Beautiful. And we'll taxi clear of the parking area, or the landing area, I should say. You can see that approach feels a lot different because the carrier is so much smaller. But it's very fun, very interesting, a cool challenge. So as you guys saw, perfect example of what I was saying. You know, on that first approach, we started low and we finished high and floated over the wires. So I chopped the throttle, came down hard, too high of a vertical speed, bounced the hook right over the wires as a result. Then on that last one, we kind of had a much better altitude on our rollout onto final approach, and then we're able to be right at the right angle of attack and right at the right vertical speed to really catch those wires. For me, the hardest part of a carrier landing is thinking of the hook being all the way at the back end of my aircraft, and thus trying to put my back end of the aircraft over the wires as opposed to putting the aircraft on the wires, such as where you would try to land on a spot with a non-carrier based aircraft on a nice long runway. So interesting stuff, guys. I hope you enjoyed this little demonstration part and talk about using the Hornet in the STOBAR environment. So let's hop over to my desktop and let's take a look at where to edit these LUA files. Alright guys, here we are on my desktop, and let's take a look at the actual LUA files that you need to edit to allow the mission editor to spawn the FA-18 on the Kuznetsov. So I have a pre-edited FA-18 LUA file here for us as an example, but to find the appropriate LUA file, you need to go to the appropriate FA-18 folder. So that's going to be in your actual install folder, not your saved games folder. So you're probably going to find that in your C drive / program files / Eagle Dynamics / DCS World Open Beta, or if you're on the standalone regular version, not the Open Beta, that's going to be just DCS World. Now, there's two different Hornet files in your install of DCS World. We want to go to the Hornet file that's located under Core Mods. So make sure you click on that. Go to Aircraft, scroll down, of course, to your FA-18C. You may have more aircraft, you may have less aircraft than I have installed. I just want to make sure you find that FA-18C folder. And then the actual LUA file you want to edit is going to be the FA-18C.LUA file. You don't want to edit any of the other FA-18C LUA files, as you may have some kind of issue with how the aircraft functions or displays. We just want to make one very specific edit that changes no functionality of the aircraft itself. So you're going to need to have a LUA editor. I like to use Notepad++. I think it's the best one. And we'll open this guy up. And then let's go ahead and open up my already pre-edited FA-18C LUA file here. So we can swap back and forth between these two, but let's look at the vanilla one first. You're going to want to hit Control F and just search for the word carrier. That's all you need to find. And down here, starting at line number 304 on the LUA file, we need to add an entry into this. So that's where we can take a look at my already pre-edited LUA file, and you want to, again, of course, we'll find carrier. And we need to tell the LUA file and thus DCS World that we want to have the jet to be able to take off on not just aircraft carrier with catapult, but also aircraft carrier with trampoline. So you basically just want to add a second entry, brackets 2 equals name equals aircraft carrier with trampoline, then end to and end of takeoff runway categories. So I'm going to copy this and paste this in the description of the video here, so that way you guys can just simply edit and copy and paste and put it right there, save it, and you're good to go. So you just want to essentially copy this text, a little Control-C for copy, and then we will essentially just grab these guys, paste, then file and save, and you're good to go. The aircraft will now be able to take off from the Kuznetsov. Pretty cool stuff. Something to also note is the AI Hornets actually work absolutely fine with the Kuznetsov. They can land, they can take off. They actually use the holdback blocks when they take off, and it doesn't affect their landing gear. It's pretty cool. So the AI is absolutely fine with this. So you can create your own single player mission with the AI, no problem. So that's all there is to it, guys. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and I hope this helps you out and gives you something new and something cool to try out in DCS World. So we'll see you in the next one, guys, and fly safe out there.